Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org on this snowy morning, we're so glad that you are here. This is the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter, and in conjunction with a Saturday afternoon series that's been happening, this is the second of two sessions of the forum focused on contemporary evangelicalism. And as our kind of guest host, I'm going to turn it over to our seminarian, Nathan Peace, to introduce our guest.
Thanks, Peter. I am so excited to introduce my friend Isaac Sharp. Isaac is a fellow former Southern Baptist from the Deep South, so we have many, many things in common. He holds a PhD in Christian ethics from Union Theological Seminary here in New York City. He is currently on the faculty there, leading the Master of Arts in Social Justice. He's the author of a book called The Other Evangelicals, which you'll hear much more about now, but I'm really personally excited about his current project, which is a new, fresh, different look on the history of the Southern Baptist Convention, which I think is going to make quite the splash in the academic community. So please join me in welcoming Isaac Sharp.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you all for having me today. I'm excited to get into some of this stuff. This is going to be fun. So we will get to some not too controversial, but maybe topics today. So this should be a good time. So good morning, everyone. Thanks again for having me. I am here today to talk about evangelicals, which is a label that comes with a lot of complex connotations, implications, and for many folks, feelings associated with it. I'm pretty sure that the mere invocation here of the word has already conjured something among you gathered. So if you'll briefly indulge my curiosity, this will be we will get some crowd involvement here. Anyone willing to share what the word brings to mind for you? Free association? Okay. Okay. Anyone personally know evangelicals? Okay, yeah. How about a potentially even thornier question? Anyone in here who would personally identify with the label in some way, shape, or form, or sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, both inside and outside of evangelicalism, are actually similarly conflicted about what it means to be an evangelical. Between as a movement, a tradition, a subculture, a theology, a list of doctrines, a sociological and so many contested that it's now basically useless and we shouldn't use it anymore. Yet another thinker, a non-evangelical sociologist of religion, has even gone so far as suggesting that evangelicals' particularly distinctive style of religious devotion has become so popular in the contemporary U.S. that, quote, there is also instance, alone, and the Bible in its entirety is the written word of God and is therefore inerrant. Another evangelical group says that anyone who takes the Bible seriously and believes in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord is an evangelical. In some settings, an evangelical Christian is just a born-again Christian. In others, an evangelical is an Orthodox Protestant. One of American evangelicalism's Oh, this better? Should I turn the other one off? Lovely. Hello, hello, hello. Very good. One of American Evangelicalism's flagship seminaries puts it this way: along with a personal commitment to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, to be evangelical has always meant affirming a cluster of doctrines, including the person and word of Jesus Christ, his deity, virgin birth, true humanity, substitutionary atonement, bodily resurrection, and ascension to heaven. For all my etymologists out there, any etymologists or any language nerds? Okay, wonderful. The Greek word euangelion essentially meant good news. Yeah, very good. We do have some etymologists here. In German, evangelisch essentially just means Protestant or even just non-Catholic. In the kinds of circles where people laugh about such things, there's an old joke that the best definition of an evangelical is actually simply anyone who likes Billy Graham. Which is funny in part because it kind of works, particularly in the 20th century American context, where evangelicalism is probably best described as an enormously popular trans-denominational movement of born-again Protestants organized and led by successive generations of dynamic leaders who successfully built a religious subculture often known for its consistent social, political, and theological conservatism. The idea that an affinity for Billy Graham represents a kind of rough and ready barometer for evangelicalness is not so far from the truth. But I would actually take that even further still, because in many ways, Graham's role in 20th century evangelical history was even larger than the joke implies. He was undoubtedly both the most powerfully symbolic evangelical figurehead, probably the most famous evangelical who ever lived, and the popularly designated representative of the evangelical masses, but he was also the prototypical version or the archetypical example, Platonic ideal of what it meant to be an official, card-carrying, capital E, American evangelical. And so, with a little tweak to the old joke, perhaps it becomes even more revealing. If 20th century American evangelicals could humorously, but not inaccurately, be defined as those who liked Billy Graham, they might also, I argue, be described as those who were like Billy Graham. Or if not Billy Graham, someone who believed, thought, acted, voted, and looked an awful lot like him. But here then is the rub. For decades now, in an unending cycle of new books about evangelicalism and its history, scholars have focused primarily on the story of these evangelicals, the liking and being like Billy Graham kind, focusing primarily on the emergence of a post-World War II coalition of neo-evangelicals who tried to blend fundamentalist theology with cultural re-engagement and who helped build an extensive interdenominational network of schools, publishing houses, parachurch ministries, magazines, conferences, and organizations. In this particular story, flagship institutions like Christianity Today, Fuller Seminary, the NAE, National Association of Evangelicals, as well as major evangelical figureheads like Harold Ockenga, Carl Henry, and yes, Billy Graham, are the main characters in this story, and justifiably so. The rise to predominance of the mid-century evangelical movement is undeniably the main event in the history of what became the contemporary mainstream version of U.S. American evangelicalism. The usual story rightly emphasizes the outsized influence of influential evangelical leaders and powerful organizations in the development of a mainstream evangelical movement, one that did indeed become known for its theological, social, and most of all political conservatism, as well as its near universally white, often suburban, mostly middle class, and overall pretty homogenous racial and cultural trappings. This is a true story, with the major caveat that they've never been totally monolithic. The official, capital E evangelicals do indeed tend to look, believe, and think like this. And conventional histories of 20th century evangelicalism have helped us understand why. But what I want to think about is what the standard portraits often miss. Although this version of the story is true enough as far as it goes, conventional narratives tend to paint an overly simple picture with a brush that's far too broad on a canvas that is much too narrow. Indeed, part of the main argument of my book is that the usual picture tends to overlook one incredibly significant aspect of recent evangelical history, which is this: the process of specifying what precisely it would mean to be an official, card-carrying evangelical was neither quick nor inevitable, and that was the case for at least a couple of reasons. For one thing, under various definitions of the term, the on-the-ground reality is that evangelicals have historically been more diverse than their representation. and the almost universally conservative white and mostly male folks who have consistently been in charge of the mainstream movement have been simultaneously ill-equipped to deal with that pluralism. By failing to seriously account for the role that those in power played in shaping what counted as mainstream, a process that has regularly involved offering kind of ad hoc rulings on what's in bounds and out of bounds for the real or true evangelicals on a host of theological, social, and political questions, most of the standard histories, this is part of my argument, tend to gloss over how the mainstream version became the mainstream version. 20th century evangelical leaders were remarkably successful at building and growing a movement of generally conservative Protestants that became known as mainstream evangelicalism. But along with this success came a serious challenge. Generally conservative Protestants just so happen to encompass a pretty staggering variety of competing and often contradictory theological, social, and yes, even particular political views. And when forced to face that uncomfortable reality of the internal pluralism within their growing movement, 20th century evangelical leaders frequently responded by sidelining minority groups, excommunicating dissenters, and generally engaging in an ongoing series of efforts to define and police the boundaries of evangelical identity. In so doing, these powerful, though often self-appointed evangelical gatekeepers defined themselves and their followers, who not coincidentally thought, believed, voted, and looked like them, as the evangelicals, claiming the label and title as their own kind of proprietary trademark in the process. I suggest we like to think of this, or should, as the formation of evangelical trademark, as this proprietary label that is closely guarded and watched. The guardians of the evangelical mainstream successfully shaped a religious identity in their own image, is part of what I'm arguing, thereby contributing to popular and scholarly perceptions of a monolithically conservative, mostly white evangelicalism that tends to be predominated by fundamentalist, Reformed, and Calvinist theologians, an evangelicalism that crucially seems to have come ready-made with these particular characteristics baked in as intrinsic features, as though this is just obviously what it means to be evangelical. My suggestion, though, is that we should think a little more carefully about how these evangelicals became the official evangelicals and how their story became the canonical version. One helpful way to do that, as I suggest in the book, is to look again back at 20th and some into 21st century evangelical history for traces of those who were pushed out, excommunicated, or defined out of the category. Those who labored for years on the margins of the movement, never quite welcomed, a movement that never quite welcomed them all the way in. Those who threw up their hands in despair over the fact that they couldn't fit within the confines of the unofficial orthodoxy. Those, in other words, who were left behind, which is an evangelical joke, by the way. In my book, I tell the story of some of those who were left behind. Those who, for one reason or another, did not subscribe to the de facto evangelical consensus on a particular issue, or who literally could not meet the prevailing cultural expectations of the mainstream evangelical world, or who lost their argument for a different kind of evangelicalism, or those who believed, thought, acted, voted, or simply looked a bit different from the predominant picture of what an evangelical was supposed to be. Many of whom nonetheless defended the legitimacy of their own evangelical credentials to the mainstream leaders who told them, essentially, you don't belong. The mostly forgotten stories of these other evangelicals, and the ones I discuss in the book, are liberal mainline evangelicals, black evangelicals, politically progressive evangelicals, feminist evangelicals, and gay evangelicals. These are the folks I focus on in the book, but there are others. These are the mostly forgotten stories, I suggest, of these other evangelicals, and I argue that their stories tell us as much, if not more, about what evangelicalism has become as the conventional accounts of the most popular and well-known figures and institutions. I'll be more than happy to dive deeper into some of the specific stories that folks might be interested in, and really I can go far too long on this. Maybe during the Q&A portion we can get into some of that. And there's lots of good ones, so please ask away if you would like. But for now, instead of trying to summarize the stories of these forgotten subgroups and evangelical movements, trying to cover a whole book in our time together, and I guess my publisher would want me to say that this is a teaser, so check out the book if you would like to hear some more about these stories. For now, instead of walking us through examples, for some of these examples, for the rest of my time doing this presentation, I want to talk a bit about the formation of some of the contemporary implications and the current connections that I see between the history of these other evangelicals and the relatively recent discussion of a kind of evangelical identity crisis associated with a new wave of defectors and exiles, sometimes grouped under the label ex-vangelicals or ex-Vs or ex-evangelicals or post-evangelicals. And I had one other slide for just a recognition of evangelicalism has become known, you'll see more as a kind of connotation, like you know it when you see it kind of thing, and I'll say more about in a minute. And these are just some of the kind of cultural touchstones that folks who have inexperienced the evangelical world might realize. So as we have now seen, there are both a lot of common perceptions about evangelicals and a lot of remaining questions about how to define and describe and identify this nebulous phenomenon. In spite of yet ongoing debates, most insiders and outsiders nonetheless agree that whatever it is, evangelicalism does name something, and that something has to do with a particular way of being Christian. And this is this example. In fact, although evangelicalism may evade easy description, there's at least some consensus that it actually is not so hard to recognize once you get a feel for it. It's a kind of connotation, a culture. And it's a fun joke there. Maybe it's like the judge said about hardcore pornography. Maybe you just know it when you see it. Even so, we still seem to find ourselves with recurring waves of sustained public and scholarly interest in evangelicalism and curiosity about who these evangelicals are. For the last several decades, above all else, there's one thing, that attention in evangelicalism has been driven by one question in particular. Beginning with Jimmy Carter's surprising admission about his born-again faith in 1976 and crescendoing shortly thereafter with the role that a newly ascendant religious right played in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. And this is a picture of Reagan at the National Association of Evangelicals. And from Reagan on, and continuing apace roughly every 4 years or so, both inside and outside observers have spilt a great deal of ink, wondering more than anything else about the politics of evangelicalism. So we'll go into the stuff all of the stuff you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner table today, religion and politics. From explorations of the impact and implications of the evangelical voting bloc to predictions, explanations, and interpretations of how evangelicals vote and why they vote the way they do, evangelical politics far and away predominates the vast majority of contemporary discussions. Although debates about the particulars rage on, at this point there are at least a few points of consensus when it comes to the contemporary politics of evangelicalism. Under almost any definition of the term, for instance, it's become very clear that there are a lot of evangelicals, that evangelicals vote, and that they now near universally vote for Republicans when they do. Though that wasn't necessarily always the case, which is one of the interesting things I explore in the book. As I discuss, it wasn't inevitable that that is how things would go, and it first required this concerted effort to excommunicate a group of progressive evangelicals, now known as the evangelical left. But the contemporary fact now remains: evangelicals are known for their politics, and their politics are conservative. In one sense, then, the role that evangelicals played in the 2016 election really should not have been surprising, as it seemingly was. In 2004, around 79% of white evangelicals voted for the Republican candidate. In 2008, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 73 to 78%. In 2012, it was again right around 79%. And in 2016, it was in the neighborhood of 76 to 81%. 81% is the number that usually was the big headline after 2016. In 2020, again, around 81%, and in 2024, once more, again, it was right around 80%. It's been pretty consistent going back 20 plus years. And yet, 2016 felt different for many reasons. By some indications, for many, it was a watershed moment. There was, for instance, a lot of pre- and post-mortem analysis wrestling with evangelicals' role in general, and the now infamous 81% statistic in particular. There were think pieces and books and op-eds and tweets and articles, you name it, discussing this. There was a lot going on. After the results finally came in relatively short order, evangelical leaders with diverging interpretations of the outcome of 2016 began coalescing into a few general groups that I am going to describe as the still Trump evangelicals, the still never Trump evangelicals, and what I'm calling the not all evangelicals. Those who had enthusiastically supported him all along, the folks I call the still Trump evangelicals, unsurprisingly viewed his election and his overwhelming evangelical support as clear-cut victories. In their view, evangelicals made the right choice, they helped the country make the right choice, and that was that. With Trump in office, evangelicals could rest assured that their conservative political interests would be protected, and anyone who suggested otherwise probably wasn't a real evangelical. For the small but committed group of never-Trump evangelical leaders, the results were devastating. Some questioned their own place in the evangelical world and their complicity in what it had become. Others kept their anti-Trump sentiments to themselves for legitimate fear of reprisal. Some were driven out of evangelical communities with little tolerance for dissent. Others voluntarily walked away from a movement they no longer recognized. Another group, which undoubtedly overlapped some with the never-Trump evangelicals, reacted to the 2016 election with bewilderment, confusion, and disbelief. Some in this group, what I'm calling the not all evangelicals, quickly began trying to question or qualify numbers. Surely, they suggested, something had gone awry with the polling. It simply could not be the case that nearly 80% of evangelicals had voted for someone so crassly and openly immoral. Some pointed out that the infamous 81% number referred to white evangelical voters, or that the exit polls had inappropriately grouped all the born-again voters into the category when not all born-again Christians were really true evangelicals, or that a portion of the evangelical population had not voted, and therefore the actual number of evangelical Trump voters was far lower. Others noted that self-identified evangelicals and evangelicals defined by theological beliefs were not necessarily the same thing. That a sizable percentage of the evangelical population had actually voted against the other candidate rather than in favor of their own, and that evangelicals were by no means single-issue voters. In addition to these celebrations, laments, and qualifications, some evangelical leaders interpreted the 2016 election results as an invitation for some much-needed soul-searching about the state of American evangelicalism. One prominent example came in the form of a 2018 essay collection titled "Still Evangelical?" with the subtitle, "Insiders Consider Political, Social, and Theological Meaning." It was edited by the then president of Fuller Seminary, Mark Labberton, and this is Mark Labberton here. In his introductory essay to the book, Mark Labberton cuts right to the chase, warning that, quote, "Evangelicalism in America has cracked, split on the shoals of the 2016 presidential election and its aftermath, leaving many wondering whether they want to be in or out of the evangelical tribe." Evangelicalism, Labberton argued, both there and elsewhere, was now facing a catastrophic identity crisis. One driven not so much by divergence, in Labberton's view, from a common set of theological commitments, but instead by what he believed came down to an internal polarization problem, driven by the fact, in his argument, that evangelicals were letting their common faith tradition take a backseat to social, cultural, and political influences. There were drastic political and social disagreements among evangelicals, according to Labberton, that could only be explained by the fact that evangelicals on both sides of the divide had allowed their, quote, social locations, personal experience, and spiritual conviction to take primacy over their common commitment to the gospel. In some respects, this idea that evangelicalism is in the midst of an identity crisis is absolutely dead wrong, I think. And it would be fun for me to talk this out with Mark Labberton. For one thing, the implication that the contemporary evangelical crisis is the product of a hyper-partisan struggle between two warring factions is at best a false equivalency. From a purely statistical perspective, as we have seen, the likelihood that political partisanship will split post-2016 evangelicalism into two major parties, and this has been one of Labberton's argument, a blue evangelicalism and a red evangelicalism, is next to zero. At least when it comes to white evangelicals, support for the Republican Party in mass never really wavered and consistently remained far higher than any other religious group. The idea of a two-party evangelicalism with any sort of parity between the two sides is based on some dubious assumptions, both contemporary and historical assumptions. There is some division afoot, sure. But to imagine that a wide swath of the current evangelical world is in equal danger of becoming as closely aligned with the Democratic Party as mainstream evangelicalism has long been aligned with the Republican Party is to minimize the ongoing legacy of a much longer history of evangelical partisanship that was not inevitable, but is certainly the case. At least for the time being, contemporary evangelicalism, in my view, is in precious little danger of a cataclysmic schism along political lines. By almost any criteria of identifying evangelicals, American evangelicals remain an overwhelmingly one-party bunch. But, and this will be some of the fun stuff maybe we can talk about, there's another sense, though, in which the idea of an evangelical identity crisis is spot on. In the fallout from the 2016 election, and due in part to that fallout, there does indeed seem to be a contingent of mostly younger, though not universally younger, evangelicals who are reconsidering their relationship to their faith community. The recognition that evangelical identity has arguably become, and this is one of my arguments, a kind of identity politics for aggrieved white religious conservatives, which has this dynamic that you can see in that there are folks who are not even Christian now identifying as evangelical, identifying with the evangelical label, which is a fascinating development. This development, I think, has driven a fresh wave of questioning among a certain subset of the evangelical world. Some of these folks have already left. More of them will probably leave. Some are currently deconstructing their faith. Others are desperately trying to reconstruct their faith. For a while now, many of these folks have been loosely grouped among this previously mentioned label of the ex-evangelicals. And these are some of the, just some of this group of ex-evangelicals, post-evangelicals, and even my friend Tim is the leader of an organization called the New Evangelicals, which is trying to break out of some of these old boxes, right? What will become of this shifting sense of religious identity is hard to say. Some of these folks are becoming atheists or agnostic. Some don't know what they are. Some are trying to reclaim something like a new kind of evangelicalism, like the New Evangelicals. Some are searching for something, though they might not know what exactly they're searching for quite yet. I don't expect that the ex-evangelical phenomenon will necessarily force a major reconsideration of the future direction of the mainstream movement. Those with the power to police the boundaries of the evangelical movement are in fact redoubling their efforts currently to ensure that evangelicalism remains what it has become. And many on the inside are perfectly content with the way things are, politically, socially, culturally. In the short-term future, I don't think a wholesale shakeup or a mass exodus seems likely on their watch. Evangelical numbers on the whole seem to be declining a bit, but overall they're remaining relatively steady. And yet, on the other hand, within the span of the next generation or so, the possibility of a massive wave of younger ex-evangelical expatriates could certainly change the calculus. There does seem to be, I think, a generational unease with many of the most determinative characteristics of what contemporary evangelical identity has become. On the whole, younger evangelicals who may accept what they were told were the theological commitments of their community do appear more likely than their forebearers to openly reject the racism, sexism, and white nationalism that they have discovered coming along with those things. Some of these folks might stay and fight for change. Others might give up the ghost, shake the dust from their sandals, and move on. I think those who stay face an uphill battle that I think is getting steeper by the day. Those who wondering, though, how we got here, I might humbly suggest, would do well to consider how evangelical identity has been fundamentally shaped by this same dynamic across multiple generations of deciding who's in and who's out. Though they didn't use the same name, I think you can argue that some of these 20th century other evangelicals I talk about in the book were the ex-evangelicals of an earlier day. This new wave of exiles, in other words, aren't the first. And there are lessons to be learned from the history of those who've come before. So, I promise I'll land this plane so we can get into some discussion. So one final word about all this before we get into some discussion I want to hear from you all, which I'm excited to hear from you all. For the past 10 years or so, as Nathan mentioned, I've been at Union Theological Seminary. Anybody heard of Union? First as a PhD student and now as a program director and visiting faculty member. During my time at Union, while working on my dissertation on evangelicalism, and then when I've taught a course on evangelicalism, I have stumbled across, or these folks have stumbled across me, a small but significant group of folks who grew up in evangelicalism, started asking questions, and then somehow find themselves wandering, usually accidentally, into Union, this bastion of liberal Protestantism. For many of these once evangelical students, finding out that there was a different way of being Christian is both a revelation and a boon. Evangelicalism across the last couple of generations has this way of presenting itself simply as Christianity, rather than as one version of it, and thank God that it isn't. But here's the thing I've often discovered, both in talking about other kinds of evangelicals through history and during my time working and moving primarily in mainline liberal spaces for the past decade or so. So we have evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, post-evangelicals, and now this is my interesting question, and the main line. Where do these mainline spaces that some of us are moving in come in? This is what I've discovered. There's not a whole lot of outreach going on. Maybe there are some exceptions, and I think there are. I've seen some exceptions in certain congregations, and it may be the case that this is one of them. But I think that there could be more. I think, in fact, we're at a juncture of potential religious realignment in this country, reconsiderations or reconfigurations, maybe even of the old mainline liberal versus conservative evangelical binary. And what I would love to see and what I want to think about maybe collectively could be what I think could be a really positive counterforce in this moment would be for all of my beloved mainline folks to find ways to support, welcome, and partner with these former, and post-evangelical exiles, many of whom have no idea what mainline traditions are all about. This is a discussion, I think you all in this very forum recently had Randall Ballmer out, and he and I have talked about this a bit, and he has even said, I wonder if it's a new mainline moment could be here. And I said, I think maybe, but it won't be easy, right? Maybe we can talk about some of that during the Q&A. But this is the thing, right? I think there's a pretty significant number of folks who are currently religiously homeless. And more progressive denominations and churches along this historic mainline path and in these spaces like Union Seminary where I move shouldn't maybe sit back and wait for them to accidentally wander into their doors. Maybe we should throw the doors a little wider open. Thanks. Let's have some discussion.
So much to think about. Thank you so much, Isaac. We have plenty of time for your questions. If you're here in the room, raise your hand, and Natalie Johnson will come around with question cards, and then she'll collect them and bring them up here. If you're joining us online, you can type your questions into the chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or email me, pthompson@stbarts.org.
So to start off, I have a question sort of related to your book. You use what historians have often called the counter-narrative, so telling the other side of the story. I'm curious, from your experience doing that research and your ongoing research, what are some of the big surprises that you've uncovered that shocked you?
Loads, and maybe we can get it. I'll pick one so we don't go too far into it, or one or two. One that is kind of common, that is more commonly known than some of the others, is there has been some. I'm not the first to do research on the evangelical left, so organizations like Sojourners, Jim Wallace, the recently passed Tony Campolo. This was a significant movement that has some recognition among folks who are paying attention to religion in America, but in the broader span of things is not as widely recognized as conservative evangelicalism and the religious right. But there has been some research on that. One of the most provocative chapters of the book that gets, in certain circles, some of the most pushback actually is the early chapter on the formation of evangelical identity as explicitly as a counter to liberal Protestantism, right? And one of the most interesting things to me was stumbling across this counter to that for part of the 20th century, that even in places like Union Seminary, folks saying, yes, we're liberal, but we are evangelical liberals. There was this period of time where past Union presidents made this strong claim for, yes, we are progressive, mainline, liberal folks, but we're evangelical in a sense. So still trying to hold on to the label. They eventually gave up that fight. They at some point, I think a lot of those folks realized that they had lost the day on the fight for that label. But it's really interesting to see that it wasn't even always the case that it was the, quote, theologically conservative Protestants that were the only ones claiming this label. If anybody who knows 20th century Christian history and the fundamentalist modernist controversies that split some of the denominations in the early 20th century, you even get Harry Emerson Fosdick. Does anybody familiarity with the great preacher Harry Emerson Fosdick? He was explicitly arguing against the fundamentalists that the progressive mainline folks were evangelical Christians, meaning in his rendering, believing in the gospel. We believe in the gospel. You fundamentalists don't get to just claim this label. And so in some of it's this wild thing that I haven't seen historically discussed much, so that it's one of the surprising counter-narratives that I come across. You get Fosdick in sermons saying the fundamentalists don't get to claim this term. It's ours too, and they're trying to push us out of it, but we want to keep it. Now, historically, that has fallen out of style, but it's there. So it's just one of this really surprising things.
All right, we have some great questions already. One person wonders if you can speak a little more about evangelical feminists. This person says that their mother was a founder of the Seattle chapter of the Evangelical Women's Caucus in 1978, and they were politically active working for the ERA.
Yeah, that's a great way to build on the previous question, actually, because the evangelical feminist movement, there was an evangelical feminist movement, right? Like, this is a thing that is not widely known. That in the late 60s into the 70s and then into the 80s, there was exactly these organization that our questioner is talking about, the Evangelical Women's Caucus, which over time became increasingly kind of ecumenical and welcomed more progressive mainline folks into a kind of broader caucus that included not just evangelicals, but there was this long period of time in which there was this movement of evangelical feminists who said, essentially, we take the Bible seriously too, we just interpret like 3 or 4 verses kind of differently. These ones about what women are supposed to do, and that difference in interpretation is just that. It's a difference in interpretation. It's not a rejection of the Bible and its place in their lives, and they built this kind of robust movement that fought for stuff like women's rights and women's right to, in the broader political landscape, but for women's ordination in the church and these kinds of things, and even for the ERA. And they got it in the evangelical feminist movement. Actually was one of the ones in the evangelical world that received the most pushback of all. There was this concerted effort explicitly beginning in the 90s to say those folks are dangerous and we must get them out of here. And in fact, one thing that hasn't been, that I do talk about some in the book, that hasn't been as widely traced, Kristen Dumais' book, Jesus and John Wayne, this New York Times bestseller that's about this, that's kind of, part of what I do in the book in the evangelical feminist chapter is the flip side of her work. She's talking about how evangelical identity became tied to this like He-Man Christianity kind of thing, and part of that movement was explicitly built on, it was born out of this group of leaders who said, evangelical feminism is spreading and it's dangerous and we have to fight back against it. That in fact is the birth of this like late 90s and into the 20th century, the stuff with like Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll and all of this like this manly Christianity stuff. It was a direct response to the evangelical feminists. They inspired this backlash movement that was in fact one of the biggest backlashes, I think, in recent evangelical history. So it's great to hear that some folks have some familiarity with it, because their stories are just fantastic.
Can you speak on the place of the Great Commission in the evangelical ethos?
Yeah, when someone said proselytizing, right? Like this is in part the one of the driving factors of contemporary evangelical identity, but across evangelical history, right? Is this idea of outreach, of missions. And one of the interesting things to stick with the counter narrative, though, is it's fascinating to me across the 20th century in particular, the shifting kind of coalitions involved in missionary work and what missionary work looked like, because for a while it was actually more predominated by the more ecumenical mainline liberal folks were much more involved in something like the Great Commission and missionary work, and over time the rise of this contemporary evangelical movement that I talk about became very much closely associated more with missions and one version that I will bring the counter narrative then in there too. One version, one understanding of what it means to spread the gospel, to proselytize, because again, right, there are other renderings of this. This is my mentor and advisor is Gary Dorian, who some of you may have heard of, who's a Christian social ethicist and historian of many of these traditions. And one of the things that he writes about is the tradition of the social gospel, right, in early 20th century, and then the black social gospel as well, of a mission to reform society in the direction of justice based on the idea that Christians should have something to say about how we arrange society. And so it's always interesting to me, the shifting lingo of what the Great Commission and outreach looks like. But yes, it certainly is the case that proselytizing remains a central feature of evangelical identity.
We have several questions about how you ended with the potential outreach by mainline congregations to evangelicals. One of them is how do you suggest that we do that? One questioner, an additional questioner, makes the suggestion that perhaps a focus on Scripture might be a way to reach out.
Certainly the case, right? And it's going to look differently in different contexts, right? Different arrangements or different denominational homes of mainline Christianity will have different emphases and different features, and some of it becomes a more natural fit. Some of us who grew up in this world find our way into, and so that dovetails to what one of my suggestions would be: find the folks in our midst who have some experience with this world and understanding what this world is like and understanding this narrative and the personal complexity and at times trauma. There are folks who have had traumatic experiences in very conservative evangelical circles and evangelical spaces who are driven out entirely. Some of them end up wandering in, and recognizing that this is fraught and complex and is difficult to work through. I am always pleased when I hear that there are congregations who are holding groups for folks like this who are religious exiles of any sort of variety. That's in my kind of, right, I still identify with this thing called the Christian tradition. In my kind of rendering, one of our theological mandates is to welcome the outsider and the stranger, and to be the place for people who are exiles and wandering. And what better way to do that than folks who are exiles from other denominational traditions or broader interdenominational traditions? It certainly will not be, this potential for realignment is certainly going to be complex, like any coalition building is, right? That's another of my Gary Dorian's quotes that I always hold on to, that if you are in a room with people who just agree with everything you say, you're not coalition building, right? And that is difficult work. It's challenging work when folks come with different kind of backgrounds and perspectives. But, right, in any version of the Christian tradition, Scripture has a place. So finding commonalities there, right, finding ways to connect there. There are folks who find themselves attracted to some of the higher church liturgies that really do emphasize Scripture and incorporating that kind of thing. So I think that certainly is one place, the holding groups for folks like this, recognizing that it can be a very fish out of water experience for folks who are I think back to when I was a kid and went with my one of my Catholic friends' family to Catholic Mass for the first time and had no idea what I was doing, right? Like, when do I stand? When do I sit? When do I, this kid from the Southern Baptist Church and the Catholic Church was like, do you have like an instruction booklet or something that I can follow to see this kind of stuff? So even just the recognition that these experiences are new for folks can go a long way in, not making folks feel so out of water and feel more welcoming in this context. Nathan and I have even talked about this. I've said, because there are things that I miss about the context I grew up in. Potluck suppers are great. Right? There's a lot about the Southern Baptist Convention that I absolutely have parted ways from, but not potluck suppers. And I'm not suggesting everybody just throw potluck suppers, but we'll do some creative thinking together.
I'll ask a quick question and then hand it over to Nathan for final thoughts. So one other person asks if the 2016 election was a bit foreshadowed in the 1980 election, when evangelicals became okay with a divorced president.
100%, absolutely. That is where that story begins, and why it was kind of stunning to me how incredulous some folks were that it happened the way it did, because it was clear beginning in that very window between 1976 and 1980, when Jimmy Carter was elected as the first evangelical born-again in the modern era president, right? This is and Randall Ballmer does a great job of talking about this, of like of a version of progressive evangelicalism of a bygone era, and how quickly that shifted with the rise of the religious right? And Ronald Reagan being not an ideal candidate in terms of the usual some of the usual evangelical political rhetoric that has evolved over time around, divorce being a problem and that kind of thing. Reagan doesn't fit the mold for an evangelical president, but so I think it is 100% foreshadowing of this. It was clear this is a political decision that represents a coalition with political goals, and that's what happened. And in 2016 is very much like 1980, in that there are political goals that, for historically complex reasons and that weren't inevitable, but certainly are the case, became represented by one party. So it is the case, I think, that the formation of that voting bloc and the ability to predict how it's going to work certainly begins right there, right with Ronald Reagan and the 1980 election. So yeah, it's a great idea. Anybody folks who are like, how did this happen? Well, let's go back and let's start with Ronald Reagan. Let's look there and look at some of the history of this stuff, because it's laid out there. You can see what's coming a bit there with the 1980 election.
Can you say just a word or two about your current project?
Oh boy. So I am up to my eyeballs in research and study and books right now on a new popular history with Basic Books here in the city, one of New York's great publishers. So my publisher, if you're listening, I'm plugging it, Basic Books. A political history of the Southern Baptist Convention, and how the shifting tides of the Southern Baptist Convention can tell us a lot about these realignments in American religious politics. Because a very interesting thing that Nathan and I have talked about is the Southern Baptist Convention actually was not involved with this whole evangelical movement for much of the 20th century. It was its kind of own phenomenon. But in the late decades of the 20th century, you get this realignment in the Southern Baptist Convention of a fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. For a long time in the middle years of the 20th century, there were like Southern Baptist women who were going to seminary and becoming ordained, and there was massive pushback on that in the 70s and 80s, and a fundamentalist takeover and driving all of those folks out of the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Southern Baptist Convention became incredibly even more conservative along certain lines than it was before, and in that same move aligned with this broader evangelical world in the late 90s, and that has had a profound effect, I think, on the future directions of American politics that a lot of folks aren't paying attention to. So, and part of the book is tracing this kind of emergence of Baptists as this kind of dissenting denomination that was like anti-establishment, anti-authority, anti-hierarchy, and how the ironies of that evolution over time to become this effectively state church in certain portions of the country, like where Nathan and I come from, Southern Baptist, like it is almost the Catholic Church of the South now. And how that happened is a really interesting history, I think, that a lot of folks don't know about. So I am working on a history for popular audiences of how that happened. So yeah, be on the lookout for that.
Isaac, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. And I'm always happy to talk. So folks who had questions that we didn't get to, please find me, and we will have contact information for me. Always reach out. I'm glad to chat about. I will talk your ear off about this stuff. So please ask me questions more. Thank you all so much.
And I'll just add that Isaac's book is available in our bookstore, so if you're here in person, you can stop by the bookstore and pick up a copy on your way out. Next week, we will have Nathaniel Gums, who is the director of chapel music at Yale University here. In conjunction with Black History Month, he's going to talk about black organ music by composers past and present. So hope to see you then, and hope you'll join us for worship at 11 a.m., either in person or online.
That was all right.
Absolutely. It was fascinating, and you were like a mile a minute.
Yeah, that's enough material in the word count stuff that I was like, this may run over
like,
30 minutes, but I talk pretty quick, so I hope everybody can keep up. I hope I didn't go too quick.
Oh, you were great. It was really super interesting.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Sorry to run in and run out, but I'm going to get dressed up.
You have duties. So,
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having
Appreciate
me.
it.